Support for the Brewlosophy podcast comes from the following. Love to Brew is a national leader in homebrewing supplies, offering exclusive products such as East Coast yeast, TV taps, and Brewlosophy recipe kits, all with free shipping on orders over $75. When you need brewing ingredients or equipment, check out Love to Brew at love2brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Welcome back to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me today is my friend and fellow Brewlosophy contributor, Malcolm Frazer, to chat about a beer everyone loves to hate, a style so controversial, it receives oodles of hate on social media around this time every single year. That's right, today we're going to be talking about pumpkin beer. Malcolm, you're a fan of the style.
So I like any beer when it's brewed well and balanced, for the style. So I cartoonishly ping on them when people just love them over the top, but I brew one every year, and I usually try a few every year, and I don't know, I like them. I'll have one or two, when I go out, whatever, but I'm not one of those people who chase around the pumpkin truck.
Well, yeah, I remember, it seems like, and we'll get more into this later, but it seems like pumpkin beers, the focus among homebrewers, at least these days, is they have to be, that people don't like the word balance. But it seems like with the spices and the different ingredients people use for pumpkin beers, they really do need to strike a balance in order for them to be, I don't know, for people who appreciate beer, maybe enjoyable.
Yeah, balance I think is different for every beer, and it's different for every person too, because there seems to be space on the shelves for those spice bombs and those sugar bombs. So, who am I to say?
No, it's a good point. I remember first time I ever had a pumpkin beer, I think it was back in 2009, 2010. And we have a local grocer here in Fresno. They're gone now, of course, but they were doing a tasting with I believe it was called Buffalo Bill's pumpkin ale or something like that.
No way.
Yeah, Buffalo.
So there's a big history on that, and we can talk about that later.
Buffalo Bill's goes way back in history. I don't know the history of pumpkin beer at all. So, but now you're making me wonder if maybe it wasn't Buffalo Bill's.
No, Buffalo Bill's. They're one of the first on record to have brewed the modern version of the pumpkin beer with spice. Oh,
well, cool. So I've had one of the, I think at least that I've had one of the original versions of pumpkin beer. Well, I think this is going to be a fun episode. We're going to talk about an experiment that we've done and some future ideas for experiments that we're thinking about when it comes to making pumpkin beer. All right, Great American Beer Festival is coming up October 5th through 7th. Jake, our newest contributor, Jason, and you, Malcolm, are going to be hanging out in Denver those dates.
Absolutely. Look for me. I'm usually wearing a Brewlosophy shirt, or it'll be hard to tell because I could be one of the hundreds of people wearing Brewlosophy Jody bags.
Yeah, and if you guys want to meet up, you can find us on social media. Let these guys know that you're going to be hanging out. You can also email any of the Brewlosophy contributors with their first name at brewlosophy.com. They'd love to hang out. They're going to have stickers they're handing out, and maybe doing some interviews and whatnot for this here podcast. All right, if you have any questions for our Brew and A episodes, please email them to me, Marshall at brewlosophy.com, or you can drop them on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of the other places we hang out online. Now, if you're looking for a way to throw some support our way, head over to brewlosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you shop at places like Amazon, More Beer, Adventures in Homebrewing, Love to Brew, and most other online homebrew shops. You won't feel a thing, and we'll get a small little kickback that helps us to keep bringing you these shows. If you want a little something in return for your support, check out our Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you'll be granted access to never-before-published Brewlosophy recipes. You receive invites to monthly video chats, and you can even work with us to design your very own experiment. That's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Finally, please make sure to subscribe to the Brewlosophy podcast wherever it is you listen to your podcast. And once you subscribe, we'd really appreciate if you'd leave us a review as well. If there's something you don't like about the show, feel free to shoot us an email or message us, and we'll try to, I don't know if we'll fix it, but we'll try to do something about it. Okay, time for the part of the show where I have my neighbors review a beer. Now, I got a little backstory on this one here. The way we do these beer reviews is I'll usually get 5 or 6 beers prepared, and then I find a time when both Jersey and Tim are available to come over and block out an hour and a half or so that they can sit and review these beers, and I serve them to them blind so they don't know what they're getting, and I leave them with these glasses and I kind of let them say what they want to say about them, and it turns into what you've heard so far. Well, last time we did this, I don't know what beer I served them or what beer they had in their glass. We had been doing a couple reviews. I had to go take care of some family business just for a few minutes. And Tim figured out how to record by himself. And so if you have little kids listening, this isn't going to be, the cleanest beer review that we've ever done. It's not too bad. It's not too bad. But I part of me wants to apologize now for what you're about to hear. And this about 4-minute beer review isn't really much of a review. So
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
I smell it.
I mean, it's all right. It's just beer. Here we go, another beer that we got to decide about. I mean, it tastes like beer. It's beer, whatever.
It's not bad.
Yeah, it's the same shit it's just beer. It tastes, hey guys, all the people out there, it tastes like beer with some differing flavors, and
It's got a little.
I'm gonna boil this down. All beer tastes like beer with some additional flavors.
And a little bit of beer.
But you know what? When I drink this, you know what I think of?
We've done way too many beer reviews for the day.
I will tell you this. Can I say, screw beer reviews, because it all tastes like beer and they get us drunk and drunk and drunk and drunk and drunk and drunk.
No doubt.
Skipping up and drunk and Shit, Marshall left and I don't think he knows this is still going.
Why did he leave?
You know what? I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about Marshall. He has small hands.
You know what that means?
He has small hands.
He can make some good beer.
Yeah, he
With
makes
small
good
hands.
beer with his small hands. He's like, how about some small hands beer? It's delicious. Hey, guys, this beer is crafted specifically for small handers. You look like a seal. Shit, dude, he's gonna come back and he's gonna be pissed at us. How did he left us alone? How do we make this live? I want this to go live to
It's live right now.
It's live. Everyone's gonna hear it. Hey, this beer review was meant to be. Hey, Timmy Tim.
Yo,
cheers.
Cheers.
Hey,
I heard it.
Cheers. I love you, and I love what you stand for, and I hate this beer. What was this beer? Did we even review it?
It is not good.
What was it? Did we even review it? Hang on.
Let me taste
sippy,
some
sip. Nah, it's terrible.
I really don't like it.
And I don't mind if you fucking hate this beer. Hang on.
You should have known.
That it was terrible.
Why'd you leave us with the microphones on?
I think I think Marshall's dealing with his children and his failed life. And
the dog wants out.
Skip, skip, attaboy. You know what? We need to shut this off, dude. He's gonna delete. He's gonna delete all this. He doesn't give a.
Well, I didn't delete it, Jersey, and I guess a part of it was to prove me putting this on here was to prove to you that I wasn't going to. This is what I'm working with, people, and this is what we deal with on a pretty regular basis around these parts. So, for those of you who didn't enjoy it, again, I guess I'm sorry. For those of you who did, you're welcome. We'll be right back. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brulosophy sent you. Time to talk about pumpkin beer. Malcolm, take it away, man. This is not a style I have ever brewed.
You have never brewed a pumpkin beer?
I've never, ever brewed a pumpkin beer. I've never had the desire to brew a pumpkin beer. I have been asked by many people to brew a pumpkin beer, but I have not brewed a pumpkin beer.
Well, you had a good segue earlier, leading into your trial of the Buffalo Bills Pumpkin Ale. And the history of that was Buffalo Bill in the mid-'80s was the owner, and I believe brewer as well, of Buffalo Bills. So his name is Bill Owen. And he had read about some of the history of pumpkin beer, and I can get into that after this little portion. But essentially, he wanted to try that. So he grew some pumpkins, or he had been growing some pumpkins in his garden. He used those, and he put them in the mash, and he added it to an amber ale recipe. And what he found out was it didn't have much pumpkin flavor, So he's like, okay, these aren't very squashy. So he had an epiphany. He thought, well, what do people associate with pumpkins? Pumpkin pie spice.
Pumpkin pie, right.
Yeah, so what he did was added some pumpkin pie spices. I think it was during the in the fermentation, or bright tank, like at the end of the fermentation, and it was a hit. For a couple decades, or about a decade and a half at least, he was like the sole pumpkin brewer. And it wasn't until probably the mid to late '90s that a national brand, which is actually Blue Moon Pumpkin Harvest, came onto the scene. So that was like the rebirth of pumpkin, but it was a new twist on it with the pumpkin pie spice. And prior to that, a lot of people don't realize it, but pumpkins are indigenous to the Americas, especially the North America, from Mexico on up. And there's records of various gourds and squashes being here. So when the Pilgrims and first settlers came over, and being that no matter where humans seem to go, they want to ferment something. They were looking for something to ferment, and being that there were no maltsters around, they found the first starchy thing they could, which was, and that was in abundance, and those were pumpkins. But at the time, they weren't quite like the pumpkin we see today. But regardless, they got these pumpkins together, and that's what they were fermented. So it was almost really a pumpkin wine, because there was little to no grain in it, right?
What you're saying is like the original American beer then is pumpkin beer.
Right. Yeah, it seems to be so. Some of the first recipes, and there's poems and riddles and songs about pumpkin. Starting in the late 1500s, early 1600s.
Huh.
So these things were ubiquitous and probably important to their survival.
Sure, yeah, I can see that. It's so I think when we think of pumpkins, most people in America at least think of like the jack-o'-lantern Halloween pumpkin, big, right, huge gourd that you take all the seeds out and carve up. That's not necessarily the pumpkins these folks were using to make their beer or whatever drink it was they were making. No,
those pumpkins were more or less bred to do what we use them for, right? They have a thick, cardboardy like flesh and not a lot on the inside. There's some flesh, on the rind, whatever you want to call it. But, the pumpkins that we consider jack-o'-lanterns aren't necessarily the best for eating. And the pictures and drawings of the various squash varieties from back then, they look almost like just this smorgasbord of types and colors. There's like green and striped, and some of them are the acorn. Some of them are like long, like what they call crookneck squashes, and... Yeah. We're not going to get into all the botanical terms because one, I'll mispronounce them, and two, there's just so many, and when they talk about these old squash varieties, they talk about how they would be undone but for the pumpkin, and how to use them to make tarts and soups and stews, and how to mash their flesh to make almost like a pumpkin soup and then ferment that.
Sort of analogous to maybe the potato in Ireland.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, just used for everything. And so it's I suppose it's not too surprising that some very clever imbibers discovered that pumpkin contained enough sugars that extracting that and fermenting it worked for them.
Well, in my head, as the boat was settling, 2 or 3 people jumped off and started looking for something to ferment.
Yeah.
So they're still rowing ashore, and they had scouts we need to ferment something, people.
That'd be like you and me, if we were lived back in Christopher Columbus days, I suppose.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I imagine fairly quickly they found something that had some, that was, 1, abundant, and 2, somewhat easy to work with, and that had sugar content.
It sort of makes me wonder, where would we be today if we just stuck with making pumpkin beers? I don't know if I'd be a home brewer because like I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of these pumpkin beers, and I don't hate on them. I think a lot of people think it's fun to make fun of people who like pumpkin beers, or to make fun of pumpkin beers and pumpkin beer season, as it were. Yeah. Whatever. I am too. It's kind of fun, but in all seriousness, whatever, people like what they like. It's just kind of a fun little thought experiment to think of if beer today was still based on pumpkin and not necessarily malt,
Well, what happened was, as the settlers here, became more started settling and had farms, and they brought stuff that they missed from home, of course, grain became more available, so slowly the recipes they kind of start shifting to having some grain to mostly grain to no pumpkin,
Yeah, right.
But at no point could we find a spice like pumpkin pie spices. There are some recipes that mention almost like a gruit-like mixture that they had over, in Middle Europe early on. So, and there was stews they made with pumpkin that had some various spices, but not the classic, nutmeg, cinnamon that we use today.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We're sitting here talking about historical pumpkin beers and all of that. These weren't pumpkin beers as we know them today. These were beers that were fermented, basically pumpkin juice. They weren't adding pumpkin pie spice, which is kind of where we're at today seems to diverge from history.
Yeah, well, at first they were pumpkin wines, if you want to classify them at that, because there was no grain or little grain.
Sure.
And then they became like a mix, and it was sustenance. It was something to imbibe on. It wasn't until, so far as we can tell, history is only seems to be provable, if it's written down, so somewhere between the 1919, there's a couple recipes for what they call pumpkin flip, which is like an ale, and they toss it and froth it up with a hot poker, a flip iron, and there's another name for it. I can't think of it right now, but essentially they get this hot poker. It's almost like a large cast iron spatula or ball, and they stick it in and kind of whip this pumpkin ale with some spices and some sugar, and they get it frothy, and that's what they would drink.
That sort of sounds appealing on some level. So it's like a warm beer that's sweet and spicy that's made from pumpkin.
Frothy, yep. And there's going to be some caramelization that goes on, with the hot iron.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of getting a little bit closer to where we're at today, though. The modern pumpkin ales that we're seeing on shelves and homebrewers are making nowadays seem far more focused on producing a beer that tastes more like pumpkin pie than it does actual, like if you bit into a pumpkin. Yeah,
and you could probably make like a flip-like beer because, they mixed it with rum. They mixed it with brown sugar. And like I said, I have a recipe from a colonial folk. It's called Colonial Folk Ways by Charles McLean Andrews. That was 1919. So somewhere around 1920-ish to 1980, which is really only 60 years if you think about it. There's not much so far as I can find, I'm sure if I dug better, but there's not much mentioned about pumpkin beers between those times, And then all of a sudden, Bill Owens, boom, pumpkin beer. And, they took they had the wherewithal to record it and mention it, because it was part of their business. And then, 15 years later or so, it's on the scene. It's all the rage.
Well, Bill, I guess thank you for changing the world of brewing between the months of October and December. Because it seems it seems basically you can't get on Facebook or Reddit or Instagram without seeing some sort of a pumpkin beer reference around sometime in autumn. So yeah.
Well, and that's would be the American way, that they're quite different. You have something like Dogfish Head pumpkin
ale.
And that's much less spicy than a lot of them, in my opinion. And then you have like these, most of them seem to be amber ales, but you have some of these stouts and porters and whatever. And some of them are just completely, let's like Yankee Candle, just mulling spices in your face. And some of them are very sweet, and some of them, so
if somebody wants to make a pumpkin ale, it seems like there are certain base styles that people tend to stick with. You mentioned amber ale. I think that's probably the most common that I've seen. But it seems like given this kind of push to make more of a pumpkin pie flavored beer, that there might be some other styles that work really well. Have you tried making pumpkin beers with different base styles?
Yeah. So I used to make a pumpkin Weizen. And that kind of had like the little bit of clove from the fermentation, and so I used Weizen yeast. I goosed up that eugenol spice character with some ginger and nutmeg, but essentially it was a Hefeweizen with pumpkin puree, and I served it with dessert usually, and for Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
relatives would come over. It was something different, but it was kind of like, I don't know, 5.5%. It's a little bit heavy for a Weizen. Maybe it was like a Weizenbach.
Yeah, that's definitely the most unique pumpkin style or like base style I've heard used to make a pumpkin beer. Some that I think about though, like, okay, so you got, to me it seems obvious to go with amber ale because it sort of has that color. You can make an amber ale that sort of has the color of pumpkin pie.
It's suggestive of pumpkin just with that amber orange hue. Yeah,
exactly. And then you start to move into some of the darker styles like porter and stout. Those sort of make sense. They're heavier, they're rich. You're going to get that perception of sweetness with a little bit of the roast, and which I guess plays well with some of the spices, the pumpkin pie spices. But some things that I've been thinking about, one of my favorite parts of pumpkin pie is the crust. And when I think of like pie crust or even bread crust or whatever it is, my mind kind of goes towards some of the pale lagers or like a blonde ale, maybe even like a cream ale or something like that. And I just wonder if maybe we might be missing something here that those could make a pretty decent pumpkin ale.
I think there's space there, but I think if you actually add pumpkin, you're going to take that color from a nice light yellow to into the orange copper range, and a lot of the hallmark flavors of those styles, I think, would get stomped to death by pumpkin and especially the spices. So you'd have to be, very controlled on your hand as far as that goes.
That's a good point. Maybe that crackery bread crust thing that you typically pick up in a good, a Pilsner or something is just going to get covered up with the pumpkin pie spice and all that stuff.
The recipe we used is for the Great Pumpkin experiment, which we'll talk onto about after the break. That was designed to be crackery, in bready, because it's Vienna and Munich, and that's what I was leaning for with the Vienna and Munich, is trying to get that melanoidin, bready character to be reminiscent of crust.
Yeah. A lot of the recipes that I've bumped into online use pretty heavy doses of malts that are typically known to impart that type of character. I've seen 5% to 10% biscuit malt, victory malt, a lot of Munich, a lot of Vienna, stuff like that. Pretty typical of pumpkin beers.
A lot of caramel too. A lot of caramel malts.
Oh yeah, you got to get those caramel malts in there to in my opinion, to sort of buffer all of that spicing. Yeah. So, okay. Speaking of spices, this is one of the areas. Now, I have to believe, and maybe I'm just being presumptuous because this is where I'm at, but I have to believe one of the issues that some people take with these pumpkin beers is the type of spicing, the level of spicing. What you mentioned nutmeg. You know, when I think of pumpkin pie, I nutmeg, cinnamon, clove. Those are like the three main things that come to mind. And one of those, to me, just has no place in beer, in my opinion, outside of Weizen, like you mentioned. And that's that clove character, that 4-vinyl glycol.
So I don't like clove when it's over the top either. To me, it's just obnoxious and it just smells like medicine.
Yes.
But, you know, I think if someone was, you know, had a deft hand, a little bit, I think is okay, you know, because a lot of pumpkin type desserts have that in there. But I choose to use allspice instead. It has the same family of spices as the clove, but it's a little less subtle. It's a little less in your face.
A little more subtle, yeah?
Yeah, a little more subtle, yeah. So that's what I do, but, you know, if you like cloves, go for it. It's your rodeo.
Yeah, I almost feel like even if there's no clove in a pumpkin beer, my mind is so trained, I guess, to expect that cloviness that it's just, again, I get that medicinal, you know, kind of like leaves that lingering spicy flavor on my tongue, and it's just not my jam, but I know it is for other people, and that's that's totally cool.
All those spices that are in the pumpkin pie and even apple pie and the mulling spices, I think they're all part of the eugenol class, and they have an oil that is partially numbing.
Yep.
So cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, allspice, clove, they all have that. So some people find it quite offensive, especially if it gets too powerful.
Yeah, I wonder if
that like chloroseptic feeling in your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. That chloroseptic feeling is what. And I wonder if different people have different sensitivities to it. And it'd be kind of fun if that were the case to measure to see like a correlation, if there's a correlation between people with this sensitivity and their preference for pumpkin beer.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, because those spices, I like cinnamon toast, you know, whatever. I like pumpkin pie, but when it gets to be too much, it is too much, and I just can't handle it. Okay, so when it comes to making these pumpkin beers, there's a couple things that I think brewers have to consider or tend to consider. One of them is whether or not, really, what types of spices to use. We already kind of went over that a little bit. I think McCormick's makes a pumpkin pie spice. I know Trader Joe's has a pumpkin pie spice that just is a blend of a bunch of different spices. Do you recommend using something like that? You said you use allspice. Is that all you use?
No, so I recommend using whatever the hell you want, because some people think that the McCormick Spice Blend or whatever brand, you know, Penzeys makes a great spice blend. Theirs are always super fresh, at least around here in Pittsburgh. So, you know, use whatever you want, but also experiment. That's why I like to use individual spices, because I might just go, hey, you know, I'm going to forego allspice and nutmeg, but I'm going to add a little cardamom. You know, and is that classic pumpkin pie? No. Is it spicy with some cinnamon? Yeah. So, you know, do that. Try a little coriander. I don't care.
Well, okay. So then let's presume that somebody who's never brewed a pumpkin beer before comes up to you and says, "Hey, I'm looking to make one of these pumpkin pie beers. What would you know?" I don't really know what cardamom tastes like. I'm not really. I just want it to taste like pumpkin pie. Do you go with something like a single dosage, you know, all in one spice mix? Do you recommend that they balance out all these different spices? Like, what's the easiest way to get that pumpkin pie flavor?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is, as you said, you know, a little bit of caramel malt in the malt bill. So, you know, any recipe that you think works well. So any type of amber or Vienna type of lager, and then, you know, pumpkin or not, we can talk about that in a minute. And then probably anywhere between 5 to 10 grams of spice at flame out, somewhere around that range. And the right amount is determined upon how intense you want it. And you probably have to balance that with gravity, right? As the gravity goes up, more spicing is probably required.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you add your spices at flame out?
Yeah, I put them in about 1 minute, and I figure that 1 minute plus the cooling time is going to take away any creepy crawlies that are uninvited.
Yeah, which I mean, I'm doubtful there are really many creepy crawlies in those
Same.
spices. But the other thing that is come up quite a bit is whether or not to actually use pumpkin. And we're going to get into an experiment that we did exploring this when we come back from our break. But just to kind of hit on, the idea being that this is a pumpkin beer, and there are a lot of people, I guess, on some sort of a traditionalist kind of way, who make pumpkin beer using pumpkin because it says that there's pumpkin.
Yeah, it's a whole other concept because there's a lot of beers out there that don't use it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. And then when it comes to using pumpkin, there are a whole plethora of different approaches, right? You can just toss in any old pumpkin that you buy at the store and chop up, and maybe you boil it or you roast it in the oven, or you can go and buy pre-canned pumpkin and use that.
Yeah, you can use pre-canned or like Libby's or whatever and roast it, or you can use it raw. I think it's actually cooked, but you can use it in the mash. You can use it in the boil. You can dry pumpkin your beer, dry squash.
Oh, God.
Well, I haven't seen a wedge of pumpkin on the side of a glass yet. Maybe that needs to be done. TM.
I guarantee you somebody has already done that.
Yeah, some people think that you need to mash it because you want to convert the starches, and there actually is a small amount of protein too. So it's probably not a bad idea to mash it and boil it.
Maybe help with some head retention, something like that.
Yeah. Let the enzymes work on the starches to sugars and hopefully, I don't know, maybe I haven't tried this by the way, but maybe if you go in a little low on your mash, you can have some of those proteolytic enzymes take care of those.
That'd be interesting to explore later. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, Malcolm's going to share not only the experiment that we did on pumpkin beer, but he's going to share the recipe as well for those of you who are interested in making it. If I'm not mistaken, Malcolm, this was a beer brewed originally, or inspired by at least, a local brewery that you live by.
The non-pumpkin version was. The recipe is my own, but it's kind of morphed into this over time. But I wanted to do a non-pumpkin version because a good friend of mine, Scott Smith at East End Brewing Company, he allowed us to use the name, which he does have, I believe.
TM.
He has trademarked, but he has a Nunkin recipe, so we can get into that. But essentially, his advert is no pumpkins are harmed in the making of this beer.
Awesome. Well, stick with us. We'll be right back. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. So it was about 2 years ago. I'd been watching Malcolm post all of these, hateful things about pumpkin beers, and we started chatting about this. I thought we had something in common at that point, and then I realized that you, Malcolm, actually, hated pumpkin beers a little bit less than you let on, or at least that you were doing on social media, that you were saying on social media. And so we got to chatting about some potential experiments, some things to compare, and we ultimately settled on first testing out this idea that pumpkin is necessary in a pumpkin beer.
Yeah, I guess necessary comes down to the philosophical, right? Is it necessary for flavor, or is it necessary for your own conscience?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to claim that it has pumpkin in it, you better put pumpkin in it.
That's right. Otherwise, you got to call it something else, right? And I think more than anything, what we were curious about was whether it had an actual impact on the flavor and aroma and mouthfeel of a beer, such that tasters would be able to tell them apart. This experiment, at least, was sort of inspired by East End Brewing's Nunkin beer, which is a pumpkin beer that doesn't have pumpkin in it. Yeah,
it's a pumpkin pie flavored beer, I guess. I forget how he advertises other than the no pumpkins were harmed. Yeah, and he's on a loan. He was the first to have a clever name, but there's a lot of people who don't put pumpkin in the beers.
Yeah.
And they'll cleverly hide it, or they'll say pumpkin pie, or they'll say autumn spice, whatever terms they use. But yeah, so we wanted to see if the average taster could tell if pumpkin was or was not in a beer.
Maybe before we get into discussing the nitty gritty of that experiment, you can share the recipe with us. I know people out there who are looking to brew this style really soon so that it's ready by Thanksgiving and maybe Halloween. What's the recipe you've settled on? You've been brewing these for a while.
Yeah, so I like to have a couple basic recipes I can use for a lot of things. So if I have like a porter recipe, I want to use that as my base porter, and then maybe an imperial with a couple tweaks. So this is literally a fest beer that I was working on for quite a while, and it's almost 31% each of two-row, whatever you wish to use. And for a pumpkin ale, I'll use pale ale malt, and if you're using a lager, if you're making this a lager, I would use Pilsner malt. So it's 31% Pilsner malt, and then 31% Munich, and that can be whatever Munich you prefer. I like Weirmann, but you can be 2 or 1. Obviously, it's going to have a little bit of impact on flavor and color. And then 31% Vienna, and then I use Cara Munich by Weirmann. It's about 7%, so the balance. And you can tweak that 1 or 2% either way.
I think it's when it comes to grain bills like this. When I first got into brewing, it was two-row and Pilsner malt. Those were your base malts. And I'd get kind of confused when people say that they're using these high amounts of Munich and Vienna. The reality is those are base malts. You can use them as 100% of your grist. And so it works really well in a beer like this, where you're looking for that kind of crackery, more
Absolutely.
character.
A friend of mine made 100% Vienna pale ale, if you want to call it that, amber ale.
Yeah, I've done the same. It's great. Yeah,
it's great. So I like simplicity. That's why the numbers work out to 31, 31, 31, 7. Like I said, plus or minus whatever. Then puree. So for the non pumpkin version, we would go no pumpkin. And for the pumpkin version, I ended up mashing. I put 2 cans, and I think that ends up being like around 3.6, 3.7 pounds. So I put 2 cans into the mash. And I actually, for this recipe, I put a can in the boil, and I don't know why. I think I was trying to get every bit of chance I could for the pumpkin to have an impact. So even though I think you should probably mash it, I put a can in the boil. That was a small can.
You were voting Team Pumpkin on this one. It sounds like you were doing pretty much, and we talked about this, you were doing pretty much everything you could to make pumpkin flavor come out in that beer.
I did not dry pumpkin in my beer because I was worried that it would get in the fermenters, in the transfer lines and everything.
Oh, that'd be such a mess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the spicing, this is what I think is in the lighter end of spicing. So I like it like this, but it has done well in competition. So I use Saigon cinnamon. Sometimes the cheaper stuff on the shelf, it tastes very artificial. It tastes like the cinnamon toast cereals.
Which is absolutely delicious, by the way.
Well, hey, if you like it, the Saigon cinnamon to me is a little more perfumey and herbal, and not so just that one note. But hey,
is it so? Saigon cinnamon is actual cinnamon, whereas again, McCormick cinnamon isn't. I could be wrong, but that's not really cinnamon.
Cassia.
Yeah,
it's called
right.
Cassia. Yeah, it's a different type of bark. You can Googleize that, but essentially, there's two main types of cinnamon, and they're kind of different. One's very, very powerful in that cinnamon one note candle like cinnamon, and the other one's more floral or and herbal, in my opinion. So I use ginger, and I use this candied ginger, which Penzeys sells, and you can get it in a couple different other. I think McCormick has a version too. I like the crystal ginger. It's easy to dose. It's reliable. It's kind of the same every time. You can grate ginger too, and it lends a different flavor. It's not better, it's different. So do whatever you prefer. I used 4 grams of Saigon ground cinnamon. I used 2 grams of the candied crystallized ginger. I used 1 gram of fresh grated nutmeg, and I really like fresh grated nutmeg. 1, because I'm an Alton Brown fan, and 2,
who isn't an Alton Brown fan? God.
Yeah, exactly.
We were raised on Good Eats.
Yeah, Good Eats and Mr. Wizard. So it was like the science version and the food version.
Yeah.
So fresh grated nutmeg, it's almost the same to me as the Saigon cinnamon analogy. The nutmeg from a jar, it just tastes like this cartoon of nutmeg. Like a scratch and sniff thing you'd hang in your car. That's what nutmeg smells like. Make it smell like extra that. So fresh grated nutmeg, once again, has all these other ancillary flavors and smells, aromas going on. And that's why I kind of like it. It's softer.
Yeah. And just to bump in here, you can use, anybody brewing a pumpkin pie ale or whatever can use whatever spices they want. You go all out with this and you have the medals to prove it. I mean, this is why people win awards consistently, is because they put this much, I'm going to call it love, into their beer making. Yeah.
Futzen.
That's right. Yeah.
So, this is fresh grated nutmeg. Now, if you're going to use the jar stuff, you might have to use less, might have to use more, et cetera. So that was 1 gram of fresh grated nutmeg, and then 0.5 grams of allspice pods. Now, it's hardly anything, but allspice, just like clove, is very powerful, so you don't need too much of it, So 0.5 grams, I forget, it's only a couple pods, it's little tiny little nuggets. And I just put them, the pods I kind of pulse real quick in a spice grinder, and then I put them in the boil 1 minute.
And when it comes to hopping a beer like this, so you got all these spices that you're adding with 1 minute left in the boil. Are you going really low on the IBU? Are you using spicier type of hops? Maybe something like a Willamette or a Saaz?
So I just used Magnum in this one because I didn't really think I needed much carryover, even though Magnum is a noble hop derivative. So I just look for somewhere around like 15 to 20 IBUs. I would think in like the Hefeweizen or German Pilsner range, not Pilsner, but German ales,
So you want just that nice clean bitterness without any hop character getting in the way of the other flavors.
Yeah, just a little bit of IBU bitterness, to balance some of the sweetness. And
makes sense.
I guess if you're romantic, you'd say you have to have hops to be a beer, right?
I mean,
now, yeah. I see a lot of people use like Hallertau or Willamette. I think those work well. I really do.
Yeah, it makes sense that they would, just given the characteristics that they're known for, and they kind of match a lot of the descriptions that you gave to the spices that you're using in your pumpkin ale. So you boil the beer, or you boil the wort, and then you ferment it with what? What kind of yeast do you go with?
I like to use English because it leaves a little bit of residual sweetness behind. So I used 002, and I've used 007 as well. They leave a little, like maybe in my experience, if I start around 1050, 1060, I end up about a half a Plato or 2 gravity points higher with those yeasts. Mm-hmm. But I can see a case for saying I want the yeast to get completely out of the way. I want it to be, dry, then go with a Cal Ale yeast.
Do you typically aim for a bigger, higher OG on these beers?
No. Once again, mine's aimed to be drinkable, but I would say like in the 6 to 7 is a sweet zone.
Yeah.
So I think this beer was targeted 1.064, and I also wanted it to end with a little bit of residual sweetness, a little bit of mouthfeel as well. So with the 002 and 007, I usually end up around 1.012, 13, somewhere around there. Like, what's that, 3 Plato?
Pretty typical of like an amber ale.
Yeah,
like
yeah. So a lot of times if I use like a Cal Ale or a version of that, I end up around 12 to 10, 1 point. So 2.5 Plato so, and that's okay, but it's a bit dry.
Yeah, sure. So what do you typically mash a beer like this at? Maybe like 154, something like that?
Yeah, 154, 152.
And then you're fermenting it just kind of wherever you would ferment with the yeast that you're using, maybe 66, 68?
Yep, right in the sweet spot for that particular yeast. So I ferment almost everything. Ales, I almost always do 65 and let it rise up to like 67, 68.
Yeah, that's like 18 degrees C for our international listeners. So
yeah, sorry about that.
We get our hate mail, and that's almost always about not converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius. So,
and I agree. I hate Fahrenheit. Well, I like Fahrenheit, but I like metric. So,
why do you have to hate America, Malcolm?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Hey, so all right, so you get this beer. That's what you're doing with it. Anybody who wants to make that can basically be influenced or inspired by the recipe that we used. You can also check it out. This is a recipe that not only is on the experiment that we're about to talk about now, but I believe John Palmer featured it in the latest edition of How to Brew.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So I don't know if he was humoring me there or what, but he's just cool. So
that check that you got, I never got a cut of. So.
yeah, I got a handshake.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But he mentioned it though. I mean, that's just cool enough. That's just really cool.
Yeah, super cool. And I have to believe that if, as somebody who doesn't like pumpkin beer, that if I'm going to like it, I would probably like yours. So let's talk about this experiment. We were curious whether or not adding pumpkin actually made a distinguishable difference in the beer, whether tasters would be able to tell apart a beer made with pumpkin from one that didn't have pumpkin, all else being completely equal.
Yeah, so we ended up using that recipe, one with and one without the pumpkin, and served it to a bunch of unsuspecting victims. And we ended up with 40 people tasting this one. And like most of our experiments, it had a pretty varied group. Some BJCP judges, some experienced home brewers, actually had some professional brewers as well. So, pretty good makeup.
It looks like you served one sample from the Nunkin, which we're calling it, thanks to East End for letting us use that, the beer without the pumpkin in it. And then two samples were from, had the pumpkin in it, the beer with the pumpkin in it. And we asked these tasters to, try to pick out the one. They didn't know what it was. They were blind. So we just said, pick out the one that was unique. And in order for us to achieve significance with 40 participants, 19 of them would have had to made the correct selection in order for us to say that there was a noticeable difference.
Yes, but alas, only 17 were able to identify the unique beer.
Which is not only not significant, it's less than half. That leaves us with a p-value of 0.11 for those who geek out on that kind of stuff. But ultimately what that tells us is that the pumpkin didn't have a big enough impact for a significant number of tasters to be able to distinguish the beer that didn't have it from those that did.
Right. And we like to talk about the perceived versus the measurable, and the pumpkin beer did have a slightly higher FG, and I believe it had a slightly higher OG, probably because some sugars from the pumpkin, and it actually finished, one gravity point higher, which is probably insignificant, but there was a measurable difference there, and yet they were still unable to achieve a significant result on that tasting panel. So I thought it was kind of interesting there. And also the preference data.
I was just going to bring this up. To me, this is one of the more striking things about this experiment.
Yeah. So 17 tasters were correct, and even though we give the disclaimer that, because it was insignificant, this could mean nothing, etc. But we had 13 of the 17 people actually endorsed the no pumpkin Nunkin batch
as the one that they preferred, right?
They preferred.
Which to clarify what this means, every time you take one of these surveys, regardless of whether you're right or wrong, you move on to a preference section. If you were wrong on the triangle test, you're comparing the two same beers, and we're asking you just between those two beers, still totally blind to what the variable is, which one do you like the most? So we throw that data away. We don't pay attention to it. But those who are correct, they're asked to compare the two different beers. So in this case, that was one made with pumpkin and one made without it. And strikingly, 13 of the 17 people who got it correct, who got the triangle test correct, said that they liked the Nunkin batch more, the one without pumpkin in it, which is pretty mind-boggling, seeing as not a significant number of tasters were actually able to identify the odd beer out in the triangle test. Makes me wonder if there might be some sort of a sensitivity to these flavors.
Yeah, I was wondering that too, about the preference portion. I wonder if there was something, in my mind, I'm just going, well, I wonder if there was like a vegetal character that they just didn't like, and they didn't know why, but subconsciously they didn't prefer it.
Right. It tastes like broccoli or something.
Yeah, who knows? And a lot of people will say for acetaldehyde, they'll say that instead of green apple, which is the classic, flavor for that off flavor, some people will say raw pumpkin.
Yeah,
but not so much like Libby's.
Pumpkin.
Yeah, not so much Libby's canned pumpkin or whatever other variety, but the smell of like you open up a pumpkin.
Yeah,
that raw. So, I wondered if it was like, did they think it was DMS? Did they think it was a vegetal yeast stress character? So I don't know. I'm obviously just grasping here.
Yeah. So at the end of the preference part of the survey, those folks were then asked to they were informed of the nature of the experiment and what was going on, what the variable was, and then asked to try to identify the beer this is only the people who are right on the triangle test, try to identify the beer that was made without the pumpkin. And interestingly, I believe only 9 people got it right. And so, which means the other 8 didn't. So of those 13, most of them didn't really know which one did or didn't have the pumpkin in it when they were informed of what was going on, but they still had that preference. It's just super interesting.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, over multiple tastings, and obviously I started digging and looking for some way to tell these beers apart. But my first trials, I wasn't able to tell them apart. But I think, and once again, it's just conjecture on my part, as the beer started to settle and get a little more clear, I was able to start differentiating the beers, But it's unscientific. I didn't test myself some number of times, some preset number of times, whatever.
So then, in the end, Malcolm, you're going to keep making these pumpkin beers. Are you gonna include pumpkin or not?
I think I will, because I'm a bit of romantic when it comes to that stuff. Is romantic the right word? Nerd?
Sure. I think you're terribly romantic.
Oh, thank you, sweetie.
Yeah. I received the flowers last night, by the way.
Yeah. But you keep picking me for a roommate?
hey, what happens at HomebrewCon stays at HomebrewCon, okay?
Right.
So
I think I will. I think I'll add some in the mash. And I want to try it again. Of course, that was one experiment. I would like to see if I can eventually maybe some other method. Like we talked about roasting.
Yeah.
What if we roasted them? Would that character just be the roast character, not the pumpkin character? I don't know.
Exactly. Like, is it going to be the sugars that kind of come out and caramelize during the roasting process? That's definitely on the experiment list for the future pumpkin experiment batches. I think roasting. I think also, the point at which you introduce the pumpkin, that could be an interesting one. But I also think there's a lot we can do with just the spicing component, and maybe like a pre-blended mix to your as my friend Jersey would say, hoity-toity. All blend, different spices, individual spices blended together, type of thing.
Yeah, the Pinky's Out version of the spicing versus the off the shelf.
Yeah, exactly.
I would like to see that too. See if it does matter, because if you're spending, so those spices I have, in my spice cabinet. So to me, it's not a big deal. But you could imagine if someone doesn't use those spices, like, well, why should I buy every single individual one when I can just throw in brand X?
Yeah. So I think another interesting one as well would be, fresh pumpkin versus canned pumpkin. And, maybe those do have some sort of an impact that we're just kind of unaware of at this point. Despite the fact that this experiment showed that whether we added pumpkin or not didn't seem to make at least a big enough difference for most people to tell it apart.
Right. And perhaps we just need to run that experiment again,
Well, I look forward to you brewing more pumpkin beers and writing and talking about it, man. Because I'm not going to be doing it. These results don't inspire me to want to make a pumpkin beer. I probably will refrain from doing so for the rest of my brewing career.
All right, well, I'm here for you.
All right, man. Well, hopefully that was as interesting for you as it was for us. If you like what we're doing and you want more of it, head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can help us out. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for supporting us at patreon.com/brewlosophy. If you have any questions you want answered on a future Brew & A episode, you can email them to marshall@brewlosophy.com, or if you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, you can ask there too. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back soon with the next episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.